Warning, this episode contains extreme graphic details about bodily fluids within humans and animals. If you have a weak stomach, I advise skipping this one, or just not eating during this story, as you'll probably get sick. Listener discretion is advised. Good folk, I bid thee welcome unto Northern Nightmares. I am Andrew, thy host of this eve, and shall recount unto thee tales of dread, mystery, and misfortune. This week's story is going to be a little different than what I've normally done. We're not going to explore killers or aliens or ghosts or anything weird in that sense today, but I'm going to tell you about one of the darkest moments in human history. Our story takes us all the way back to the 14th century, to medieval time when kings and queens and knights would roam the lands. However, I can promise you that this time period is one, and I quote the famous Marcus Parks of last podcast on the left, not a time that you would want to be alive, as during this century most of Europe and Asia experienced the worst pandemic known to man. This plague is known as the worst sickness to ever hit humans, and it is called the Black Death. This is the first part of my new series I've titled Pandemic Nightmares. My goal for this series is to introduce you to 3 of the worst pandemics that have hit mankind. This first part, I believe, is the mother of all pandemics, and after I'm done, you'll be happy we didn't experience this during COVID-19. This series isn't going to be like the others where I've done one continuous story, but each part will be its own little mini episode, but all connected with the same theme. And however, I will be comparing the other 2 pandemics to the Black Death, as I believe they are nowhere near this magnitude, but they were serious nonetheless. In order, we will be looking at in each part will be the Black Death, then the Spanish flu, and finally COVID-19. But that's all I'm saying about the others right now. Let's get into the story of the Black Death, and I hope you have a bucket nearby because you may very well puke. I think this will be my most disgusting episode yet, and I say this will be worse than our German cannibal story of Armin Meiwes. So buckle up as we travel back in time to the ye old 14th century and see how life was like during the Black Death. The Black Death was a plague pandemic which occurred in Europe during the years of 1346 to 1353. This is considered one of the worst pandemics in human history, or at least after the birth of Christ. It's estimated that at least 50 million people were wiped out. That's 50% of Europe's population during the 14th century. This was a bacteria virus, and it spread through the land by fleas, and it was also an airborne virus. This was also the second pandemic to strike Europe in the same century. The first was the Great Famine. Before we go on further, let me explain what the Great Famine was. The Great Famine started with a series of bad weather in the spring of 1315. Farmers had crop failures that lasted right into the summer of 1317. Europe never fully recovered from this until 1322. The weather consisted of heavy, persistent rains which waterclogged fields and prevented farmers from plowing and planting new crops. Also, the weather wasn't hot enough. It was so cool that it hindered the growth of crops. Without food, millions of people became vulnerable to sickness and starved to death. Dead bodies were everywhere during this time, in cottages, rivers, and even crops themselves. It was even thought that families either ate each other to stay alive or killed off other members just to remove a mouth to feed. Also, cattle and other like animals were dying off as well, to which was now considered rinderpest, and is also called the Great Bovine Pestilence or the Cattle Plague. Get your bucket out now because I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The cattle would make loud groaning sounds because it would shit itself to death while its mouth, eyes, and nose would expel a yellow discharge. Rinderpest would give these animals the feeling of needing to defecate. However, after everything has been expelled from the body, it would continue to do this until the animal dies from the insides being all torn up. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Hopefully you weren't eating anything during that, but it's just going to get a lot worse. So no crops, no cattle for meat. If the Black Plague didn't happen, this definitely was a terrible time in history. And I also forgot to mention that all the bodies of the people dying due to starvation, they were thrown in ditches or even thrown in great bodies of water. This was beyond unsanitary. Everything was contaminated by the decaying remains. Nothing was clean, and everyone was exposed to all of this, making the health of the living even worse. If we ever get a time machine, I'd recommend just skipping this century altogether. Or unless you're into this, then enjoy your filthy trip. Now, going back to the Black Death, it's often debated to what the origins of this Great Plague was, as evidence points to areas like Central Asia, China, the Middle East, and Europe. Genetic analysis shows that the bacteria evolved approximately 7,000 years ago during the start of the Neolithic era, or the New Stone Age, in these parts of the world. Now, people weren't living in caves or fighting dinosaurs like the Flintstones, but they were living in homes made from rock and started what we know of farming nowadays and domesticating animals. How this fits into Black Death is because fleas had a strain which would evolve into what we know later as the Black Death. Basically came from fleas, to which fleas love filth, and the 14th century was a dirty time. No one bathed ever. Royalty would shower maybe once a month, and it was thought that if you were in a bath more than that, an individual would be tempted to masturbate, which at this was considered a sin, and no one wanted to go to hell. Eventually, though, the fleas would pass the plague on to the rats, more specifically, the black rat. The black rat would reproduce up to 3 to 6 litters a year, and each litter would have about 6 to 12 babies. When those babies grow up, they would reproduce with other babies or other litters. During this time, the theory suggests that there were millions of rats throughout Europe and even Asia. These little bastards also loved the dead. Bodies were their favorite food. So these rats would be spreading the diseases all over the place. And also they were found on ships, which were docked at other ports, spreading the plague even farther. Rats were the enemy. Back in this time, if you seen one, you made sure you ran the other way. And you would never just see just one, but a cluster of them. These little fuckers were carnivorous. If you fell into a cluster, they would swarm you and eat you alive. You might want to think good thoughts before bed tonight, as I think I've just given some of you nightmares. As of today, we don't have rats like that, but the black rat is still around. A lot of you may know that cities that have rat problems like New York. You may argue that New York is probably the rat kingdom. However, England has reports of rats in the 500,000s as of 2025. Mind you, they're not all carrying the Black Death, but they're still carrying other filth and diseases you don't want. Now let's turn our attention to Asia for a moment, and away from the rats for a bit. In Asia, around this time, Genghis Khan was taking over. During his wars, it's thought that a lot of people were probably dying from the plague. However, it's hard to determine as there wasn't any records during the wars. So it's unclear how many people were truly taken by the Black Death. Most of the numbers only come from Europe. How we determined the numbers for Europe was from burial records, tax rolls, and even journal entries passed down through families or royal families. However, there was no census records during this time, and a lot of numbers are estimates. It's thought that the Black Death in Europe arrived on the island of Sicily, which is an island south of Italy and in the Mediterranean Sea. When the Genoese ships arrived in ports of Messina, they were carrying fleas and rats which had the virus. It spread among sailors and throughout the island. However, after a while, Sicily closed their ports and ordered all ships to leave. However, at this point, it was too late and the virus then spread to other cities. And just like when we dealt with COVID, we closed our borders. But when this happened, the virus was already here and it already made its way everywhere else. But what exactly was the Black Death? Well, let's get into that and have your bucket ready because things are going to get even grosser. The Black Death bacteria called Yersinia pestis is a severe life-threatening disease to which it has 3 separate strains, and all of them are horrific. They are called the bubonic, pneumonic, and the C2-semic plague. Now let's go through each one, their symptoms, and why this time is the worst time to be alive. And after this, you'll be glad we only dealt with COVID and not these. The bubonic plague included fevers which went as high as 38 to 41 Celsius, or 100 to 106 Fahrenheit. There were also headaches, pain in one's joints, nausea, and vomiting. You're probably saying, oh, that doesn't sound so bad. Oh, just wait. The signature symptom of the bubonic plague was buboes. They were painful, swollen lymph nodes that could appear on one's groins, armpits, and even neck. They could become as large as eggs and would ooze pus. A little juicy, am I right? If all of this was left untreated, victims would die in about 8 days with a mortality rate of 40 to 70%, and the bubonic was the most common with about 80% of the cases. The septicemic plague was the least common form, but if one were to get contracted with the symptoms, would include high fevers, purple skin patches, which would be caused by bite marks or a cut from the skin to which the virus enters the bloodstream. It can also cause systemic infection, leading to shock, organ failure, and bleeding under the skin. If left untreated, the mortality rate would be 100% in only a couple days. The pneumonic plague is the worst of all 3. To catch this one, all anyone would have to do is inhale infectious droplets of bodily fluid from anyone like blood, sweat, or tears. Symptoms would include fever, headaches, severe weakness, and pneumonia, shortness of breath, chest pain, cough, and having a bloody or watery sputum, which is a material that's coughed up from the lungs. Mortality rate was 100%, as well as victims could die in 24 hours if not treated right away. During this time, treatment would vary on the patient. They did have antibiotics like gentamicin, doxycycline, and others. Doctors would also try stuff like bloodletting and herbal remedies. Bloodletting was a common practice where one would be drained of all excess humors from the body, believed to help with the plague. However, if you bled out too much, you would eventually die, as this practice not only let the blood out, but everything else. With nothing in one's body to fight against the disease, you would just die as you're just too weak. The herbal medicine included things like vinegar mixed with garlic, to which was believed to protect one from the sickness. Also, doctors would believe in prayers and rituals to appease God, as they thought it would ward off the plague. Well, that clearly didn't really work, and this would cause more harm than good. Also, the doctors were indeed wearing the long beaked bird mask during this time. The masks were donned with glass lens and a long beak that would be filled with strong-smelling herbs and spices. Some used lavender, mint, or even vinegar-soaked sponges. This practice was thought to filter out harmful air and protect the doctor from contagion. They also wore long leather gowns and extended it down to their ankles for protection against bodily fluids. They wore gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat. Doctors also carried a wooden staff or a wand to examine patients from a distance. This whole getup was the very early designs of what we would now call a hazmat suit. However, most of these doctors were inexperienced to deal with the ill and were untrained to cure anyone. They did more observing and taking notes rather than doing any good. The look of these doctors is very popular nowadays in art forms like the theater or comedy shows. Back then, you didn't want to see them as they were creepy as hell, and seeing them basically marked you for death. But they look cool today, makes for a great Halloween costume. So the world was burning. The dead was piling up in the streets, creepy doctors, cannibal rats, and a sickness killing everything in sight. People were defecating, vomiting, and dying painfully everywhere you look. Where could people turn to for help? Well, there was one that people fled to in the hope for answers, and that was the Christian church. Now see, the church had believed the plague was of God's doing. People had sinned long enough, and his wrath was finally coming down on the people. The church claimed Europe was being punished by God. The world was going to burn. The cities were in a disaster of biblical proportions. Old Testament, wrath of God type stuff. Fire and brimstone coming down from the sky. Rivers and seas boiling, 40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes, the dead rising from the grave. Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. The church was claiming this long before the Ghostbusters famously said these words. Maybe not the cats and dogs, but you get the gist. People were praying to God to end their sufferings. Whatever you believe, this either helped or didn't do shit. But it gave people comfort and hope that if they changed their ways, maybe the plague would finally end. There was one movement, though, that popped up during this time, and it was the rise of the flagellants. And no, I didn't say flatulence, or known as farting, even though both words are similar. I'll refrain from adding more shit talk to the story. The flagellants were a practice where an individual would whip themselves as a form of penance and atonement in the Word of God. Groups would march through towns and cities whipping the shit out of themselves and would perform public penitence as on others. These groups could be 50 to at least 500 people, basically mass groups of people beating the ever-living shit out of themselves for punishment. The whips they used were made from leather and made that donned with iron spikes. These whips would inflict pain, not fatal enough to die from, but painful enough that you would be bleeding. These whack jobs were the strangest people during this time. You could say they probably even enjoyed whipping themselves, maybe even expressed some ecstasy when inflicting the pain on themselves. Now, this wasn't a new practice, as it had appeared a century before, but it became popular during the plague. This group never had a priest. They thought it was unnecessary to have one. Who would need a priest if someone was willing to beat themselves in God's name? However, after the plague burned itself out, the flagellants would disappear, and only appearing when God's wrath showed up. Now I'm going to quote last podcast again here, because they're the only ones I could find that had this similar thought when they did their 5-part series on the Black Death. They thought that there were some flagellants that probably tried to outwhip each other. Imagine a bunch of guys screaming at each other saying, "You're not whipping yourself hard enough. Whip it harder. Fuck you, I'm whipping you myself in God's name. You need to whip yourself harder. I love God more than you. Fuck you, Thomas, I love God more than you." There's probably some people as well moaning out of ecstasy after they felt the whip. God, do you love it when I whip myself? I'll whip myself harder. These guys were a strange bunch, and this was the weirdest part of the Black Plague. This punishment was the same that Jesus Christ had endured during his time when he was crucified. When these people would show up in communities, people would flock to see them. People would sing songs and even participate in the whipping, either getting whipped themselves or having blood and spit being spit on them. Remember, besides the plague, there was other sicknesses going around as well. This included smallpox, leprosy, influenza, and even STDs. So the flagellants were be spreading these sicknesses during this time, even though people thought they were doing something great in God's name. They would be doing more harm than good. And when the plague burned itself out, the flagellants would disappear as well, fading into history, and only appearing when the time was right. By the time of 1353, the Black Death would eventually burn itself out. When people scattered throughout Europe, or at least 1/3 of the population was killed off, there wasn't many people left to carry the plague. With communities destroyed and places abandoned, the Black Death would end. However, the Black Death is actually still around today, and it continues to circulate among wild rats, and it can still infect humans. However, it is curable with antibiotics and modern medicine. The most recent epidemics in modern day seem to only appear in countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Madagascar, and even Peru. Now, there is some alternative theories on where the Black Death came from, long before fleas and rats were the main cause. One suggests that it was a resurgence of anthrax. It was thought to be in the form of the pulmonary anthrax. This is when anthrax spores are inhaled through the lungs, and these spores were found in contaminated soil, infected animals, and animal products like hides, wool, or hair. The symptoms were very similar to the plague symptoms I mentioned earlier. Another theory on the plague's origin is probably the wackiest one yet. There's claims that they say it came from space. However, there is no evidence or even an example on how it got here from outer space. I would think if it came from the cosmos, it probably was on an asteroid or a meteorite with the bacteria living on the rock. Maybe even little green men came down and infected us all just to see what would happen. But due to extensive research and supporting evidence, it shows that fleas and rodents were the main reason of the Black Death's reign during this time. As of today, the 14th century was deemed one of the worst times in human history due to the Black Death consumed and destroyed Europe during the years of 1347 and 1353. And due to this colossal event, we learned how to deal with future sicknesses and pandemics that hit our countries. Also, some things remain the same, especially during our recent pandemic of COVID-19. Mind you, we may not have plague doctors, but we did have doctors in hazmat suits, to which scared people all the same. Flagellants may not have been whipping themselves to death during COVID, but we did have people flee to churches in the hope of finding an answer to end this trauma. But we're not going to explore COVID-19 as of yet. As for next week, we're going to jump into the years of 1918 to 1920, when the Spanish flu became a global pandemic during World War I. This pandemic was all over the globe, but most notably in the United States and even Canada. But we will explore that next week. I hope you enjoyed this week's story. Did you make it unscathed without getting sick? I can promise you the next two parts won't be anywhere near as disgusting. If you have stories you wish for me to cover in future episodes, you can email me at northernnightmares@outlook.com. Hit that subscribe button to get notified when new episodes drop, and share this show to others. It will really help with the growth of this show. Remember, this is your home for nightmarish tales throughout Canada and beyond. I'll see you next week. Sweet dreams, and remember, nightmares are closer than you think.